There were two things on the shelf above the bread table that Sade Calloway had never looked at long enough to understand. The first was a brown envelope, sealed, pressed flat, between the spine of an old recipe book and the wall. It had been there since before Sade's first day. She had dusted around it. She had reached past it for the baking powder. She had never once picked it up. The second was a Polaroid photograph, small, slightly yellowed at the edges, leaning against the same spine on the other side. A man in a white dress shirt standing in front of a blackboard. Something written on the back she had never read. At 4:23 in the morning, with her hands in the dough and the only light on North Avenue burning orange through the bakehouse window, Sade was not thinking about the shelf. She was thinking about 2314. The woman who had placed that envelope on the shelf had 6 weeks to live. She had put it there 8 months ago and had not moved it since. She had placed it there because after 38 years of running this bakehouse and outlasting everything the city had ever thrown at it, she had decided the shelf above the bread table was the safest place she knew. The woman standing beneath it had $23.14 in her checking account. Neither of them knew yet what that shelf was holding. If you have ever stood in a kitchen before sunrise and felt the weight of everything you are carrying press into your shoulders like the air itself had taken on mass, you already know something about Sade Calloway. Stay with me. Because what happened inside this bakehouse on North Avenue in the winter that followed is going to stay with you long after this video ends. If this is your first time here, welcome. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every single one. Let's get into it. Sade Calloway had been waking up at 3:47 in the morning for 14 months. Not 3:45, not 3:50. Her body had settled on 3:47 the way a door settles on a particular creak, specific and reliable and not negotiable. She did not use an alarm. The alarm was for people who could afford to oversleep. By 4, she was in the bathroom. By 4:08, she was in the kitchen. She moved quietly through the apartment the way women move when there are children sleeping in the next room and walls are thin. She knew the 2 spots on the floor that complained if you stepped too far left. She knew the angle of the front door handle that kept the hinge from squeaking. These were not things she had decided to learn. They were things her body had accumulated on its own during the months when quiet was the only thing she had any real control over. She had lived in this apartment on Brentwood Avenue for 11 months. Before that, a house on Edmondson Avenue that had been hers and Devante's and then just his. At 4'9", she tied the laces on the same New Balance 6X she had worn to work since March. The right sole had a separation at the toe that she had glued twice. It held. She put on her coat, dark green, $34 from Burlington. Treated carefully because careful was what you were when you could not afford to replace things. She picked up her keys and stepped out into Baltimore in November. The walk to Vivette's bakehouse was 11 minutes. She knew the time because she had counted it the first morning and never stopped. 11 minutes down North Avenue, past the Korean convenience store with the hand-lettered sign in the window, past the laundromat that ran all night, past the bus shelter where a man in an orange vest was already standing at 4:20 in the morning. Some people's day started earlier than hers. She had stopped being surprised by that. She reached the bakehouse at 4:23. The lock had a resistance you had to lean into before it released. She had learned that too. Inside, the smell hit her before the light did. Yeast and old wood and the specific warmth of an oven that had been cooling since the evening before. Coffee, burnt at the bottom of the old drip machine Vivette refused to replace because it still worked, and things that still worked were not replaced. She turned on the overhead light, yellow, slightly dim, the kind meant only for people awake before the rest of the city. She hung her coat, tied her apron, and went to the bread table. The shelf above it held what it always held. The recipe book with the dark green spine, worn at the corners, leaning against the wall. The brown envelope pressed flat against it. The Polaroid photograph angled against the same spine on the other side. She reached past all of it for the bag of bread flour on the second shelf and began to measure. She measured by weight on the small digital scale beside the mixing bowl. Vivette had taught her this. Cups lied, scales did not. Precision was the only thing separating bread that held together from bread that did not. Sade had written that in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, not because she would forget, because writing things down made them more real. The math of Sade Calloway's life at the point this story begins was as follows. She earned $13.75 an hour, 32 hours a week, $371.42 take-home after withholding. Rent on Brentwood Avenue, $780, childcare, $340 paid to Ms. Eunice 3 blocks over, who had watched children in her living room for 22 years and did not ask questions about divorced mothers and irregular schedules. After rent and childcare, Sade had 365.68 a month for everything else. Everything else meant groceries, utilities, the prescription copay for her younger child who had asthma, the $12.50 she put in the collection plate at Greater Hope Baptist every third Sunday because she had not yet decided to stop doing that, and the minimum payment on the one credit card she had not yet cut up. It also meant the $1,847 remaining on her spring tuition bill at Community College of Baltimore County, where she was 8 credits away from a certificate in small business management, a program she had started 3 years ago when owning something of her own had still felt like a plan rather than a joke. The tuition was due in 23 days. She had $23.14 in her checking account. There had been a moment 3 months earlier when she might have resolved this differently. Maryland offered a workforce development grant for adults returning to school after 30, covering up to $2,000 in tuition annually. She had found it on a Tuesday night, sitting on the bathroom floor after the children were asleep, which was where she went when she needed to use her phone without waking anyone. The application window had closed 5 weeks before she found it. She turned off the phone and went to bed. She was at the bread table now. The dough was under her hands, cool and dense, beginning to warm. She pressed the heel of her palm into it and felt the resistance push back, the particular push Vivette had told her to listen for with her hands instead of her eyes. She had not understood that the first week. She understood it now. Vivette arrived at 6:32, 2 minutes later than usual. Sade noticed. She did not say anything. Vivette walked in, hung her coat on the hook, beside Sade's, stood at the edge of the kitchen looking at the loaves already re-proofing on the rack. Then she moved to the register side of the counter and began counting the previous day's till, quietly, the pen moving across the ledger with the same handwriting she had been using for 38 years. At 7:47 in the morning, something came through the front door slot and landed on the floor with a soft paper sound. A white envelope. Formal. The return address in the upper left corner read, Baltimore City Department of Housing and Community Development. Vivette set down the pen. She walked to the envelope and picked it up. She read it standing by the door, her back to Sade. Then she folded it into thirds and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. She went back to the counter, picked up the pen, and continued counting. But she left at 2 o'clock that afternoon. She had not left before 4 on a weekday in the 14 months Sade had worked here. She did not explain. She said only, as she put on her coat, lock up tonight, then she was gone. Sade stood in the kitchen after the door closed. She looked at the shelf, the recipe book, the brown envelope, the Polaroid photograph leaning against it. She pulled the bread at 4:17. She locked up at 5:02. She walked home in the dark the same way she had walked in. She had stopped counting the minutes. Douglas Hale had signed 11 of the 14 documents before he stopped. Not because his hand was tired, not because he had reconsidered anything. He stopped because his assistant, a young man named Pratt who had been with him for 3 years, who communicated urgency entirely through the speed of his footsteps, appeared in the office doorway and said, Meridian is asking if the full block can be confirmed by end of week. Douglas looked at the stack of paper in front of him. The North Avenue Corridor Redevelopment Project. 14 addresses, 11 signed, 3 remaining. He set down the pen. Tell them I'll have an answer Friday. Pratt wrote something on his tablet and left. Douglas did not pick up the pen again. It was 8:14 in the evening. The office in City Hall was quiet at this hour, the way government buildings are always quiet after the public goes home and before the cleaning crew arrives. The particular silence of rooms that do a great deal of work and show very little of it. Douglas had been sitting at this desk, in this office, in this building, for 6 years. Ward 7, North and West Baltimore. The neighborhoods he had grown up in, and the neighborhoods he had, depending on who was asking, either served faithfully or failed systematically. He had heard both verdicts delivered to his face. He had learned to hold them both without flinching. He was 48 years old, the youngest person elected to this council seat. He had also become, in the 3 years since his first re-election, the most reliably deliverable vote on any development proposal that came through committee. That was not how he would have described himself. That was how Garrett Foss at Meridian Urban Group described him in a text message Douglas had read 6 months ago and had not deleted. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Garrett Foss. He turned it face. The house in Roland Park, 40 minutes away. He had been taking the long way home for 3 months, since November, since the morning. He drove to a funeral home on Greenmount Avenue and arranged for his mother to be buried on a Tuesday afternoon with 11 people present, 6 of whom he did not know. 11 people, he had counted. Vivian Hale had raised Douglas in a 2-bedroom apartment on McCullough Street. She worked the register at a dry cleaning shop on North Avenue for 19 years, then a laundromat counter, then a hospital cafeteria until her knees made standing all day an argument she could not win. She attended every one of Douglas's graduations, every campaign event, arrived early, sitting front row, watching her son with the expression of a woman who had spent 30 years making sure this was possible and now felt that it was enough. She never asked him for anything after he was elected. He understood later that this was not modesty. It was her way of not making his success feel conditional. She died in October. Pneumonia, complicated by a heart condition she had managed for 11 years without telling him. She had listed her emergency contact as her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who was 74 and had called Douglas at 6:22 in the morning from a number he did not recognize. He thought about that sometimes. The emergency contact line, the deliberate absence of his name from a space where his name should have been. He picked up the pen. He looked at the 3 unsigned documents. The 12th address was a nail salon that had been operating under the same family for 15 years. The 13th was a barber shop. The 14th was 1147 North Avenue, Vivette's Bakehouse. He had passed it that morning. He had taken a different route than usual, and he had seen the light in the window at 8:15, yellow warm, the kind that exists before sunrise and almost nowhere in between, the kind that has no practical justification except that it is the right temperature for certain kinds of work. He had not stopped. He had a meeting, but he had looked. That was the thing he kept returning to now, alone with 11 signatures and 3 lines blank. He had looked. Douglas set down the pen. He walked to the window. Baltimore at night, the West Side, the lights of the neighborhood strung along the grid below him. He had grown up down there. He knew which intersections had liquor stores on both corners and which had churches. And he knew that in this city, those 2 facts were often separated by less than a block. That was the kind of city it was. Contradictory, not interested in being summarized. He was thinking about a winter evening in 1989. He was 11 years old. His mother was on a double shift. There was nothing in the apartment to eat. He had found 35 cents under the radiator that morning, enough for the smallest roll at the bakehouse 2 blocks down North Avenue. A roll was something. Something was better than nothing. He was 11 years old and hungry and old enough to know that neither of those things was something he was supposed to say out loud. The woman behind the counter had dark hair going gray at the temples and a white apron, and the manner of someone who had been standing on the same floor for a long time and did not require anything from the world except that it stay out of her way. He had put his 35 cents on the counter. She had put 1 roll in a paper bag. Then she had put a second roll in the bag without looking at him. She said, "Your mama paid already." He did not say anything. He took the bag. He went home. He ate both rolls, standing at the kitchen counter in the dark, because sitting down and eating slowly was for people who were not afraid the food might disappear. His mother had not paid. He knew that. He had known it in the moment. She was at work. She had not been in the bakehouse that day. He had never gone back, not because he was ungrateful, because he was 11 years old, and gratitude was a complicated thing when someone had given you something in a way that spared you the shame of needing it, and he did not know how to stand in front of her again and act like he was anything other than the boy with 35 cents and an empty apartment. He was 48 years old now. He had not thought about that evening in years. He did not know why he was thinking about it tonight. Standing at his office window with Garrett Foss's unanswered text on his desk and 3 documents unsigned, he only knew that he was. He turned back to the desk. He looked at the stack. He picked up the pen. He held it for a moment. He set it down. He put on his coat. He turned off the light. He took the long way home. Vivette showed Sade the letter on a Thursday morning, 9 days after it arrived. Not the day it came. Not the day after. 9 days folded in the pocket of her apron. 9 days of the register and the till and the bread coming out of the oven and not one word. Sade had learned that Vivette said things when she was ready and not a moment before, and that pressing her was like pressing the dough too hard. You only collapse what was trying to rise. She set the letter on the bread table between them without ceremony. Just set it down and step back, the way you step back from something you have put in its place and do not intend to move. Sade, read it. Baltimore City Department of Housing and Community Development. North Avenue Corridor Redevelopment Project. Notice of intent to acquire property at 1147 North Avenue under the Urban Renewal and Community Development article of the Maryland Code, 60 days to vacate. The language was polite and exact in the polite and exact when the decision has already been made, and the letter is a formality rather than a conversation. She read it twice. She set it down. "How long have you had this?" she asked. Vivette said, "Long enough." That was all. Sade went home that evening and sat on the floor of her bathroom with her phone, which was where she went when she needed to think without anyone watching. She searched tenant rights notice of intent to acquire Baltimore City. She searched Small Businesses Appeal, Urban Renewal, Maryland. She found the Maryland Volunteer Lawyers Service on East Redwood Street, which offered free consultations to small business owners facing government acquisition. She wrote down the address. She wrote down the hours. She wrote down the name of the attorney on the intake form, Bernard Ossie, specializing in property and commercial tenant rights. She called the next morning from the bakehouse back room while the second proof was rising. The appointment was in 4 days. She did not tell the vet she had made it. Under Maryland Code Real Property Section 12101, a commercial tenant facing government acquisition had the right to file an administrative appeal within 30 days of formal notice. The appeal triggered a mandatory hearing before the Baltimore City Board of Municipal and Zoning Appeals. The process did not guarantee reversal. It guaranteed the right to be heard. The notice had arrived 11 days ago. Sade had 22 days left. She went to the appointment alone. Bernard Ossie explained the process without softening it. The appeal required evidence of community impact, letters of support, tenure records. The city won these hearings more often than it lost. The record mattered regardless. She asked how many signatures on a community petition were meaningful. He said, "There's no legal threshold, but I've seen 200 change a room." She went back to the bakehouse and made a list. Over the next 7 days, Sade walked the 8 blocks surrounding the bakehouse before and after shifts. She knocked on doors. She stopped people at the bus shelter and outside the laundromat. She explained what the letter said in plain language, because plain language was what the situation required. By the 4th day, she had 114 signatures in a spiral notebook she had bought for $1.89 at the dollar store on Reisterstown Road. By the 7th day, she had 231. She did not tell Vivette, not because she was keeping a secret, because she was not finished yet. It was on the 8th day that Garrett Foss came to the bakehouse. He arrived at 7:12 in the morning, before the open sign was turned, when only Sade was in the kitchen and Vivette had not yet arrived. He knocked on the glass door. He was wearing a gray overcoat and carrying a leather portfolio and had the look of a man who arrived early to things because arriving early communicated control. Sade unlocked the door. He introduced himself, Meridian Urban Group. The company was prepared to offer $4,200 for the bakehouse equipment, ovens, racks, the proofing unit, the commercial mixer, cash, same-day simple bill of sale, a fair number for used equipment, a clean start. He said all of this in the tone of a man doing someone a favor. Sadie listened to the whole thing. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she looked at him for a moment. $4,200 was her tuition and 2 months of rent. It was the number that would let her stop doing the math that lived behind every other thought. She knew exactly what $4,200 was. She had been doing that calculation for 3 years. She looked past Garrett Foss at the kitchen, at the bread table, at the shelf with the recipe book and the brown envelope and the Polaroid photograph, at the ovens that ran 2 degrees hotter than the dial said, which she had learned to account for the way you account for anything that belongs to you, as imperfect and not going anywhere. She looked back at Garrett Foss. "No," she said. He blinked. "Miss Calloway, no." She said it the second time the same way she said it the first. Not louder, not harder, just the same. As if repetition was unnecessary, but she was willing to provide it. Garrett Foss stood in the doorway for another 3 seconds. Then he clicked his portfolio shut and left. Sade locked the door behind him. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she went back to the bread table and put her hands in the dough and continued what she had been doing before he knocked. That evening, Vivette arrived at 6 o'clock, 30 minutes early. She came in through the back door and stood at the edge of the kitchen. Sade was cleaning the proofing rack. She did not look up. "Foss called me," Vivette said. "I figured he would. He said you turned him down." "Yes." Vivette walked to the small wooden chair in the corner and sat down. Sade finished the rack, wiped her hands, and pulled the second chair beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. The oven ticked as it cooled. Outside, a bus went by on North Avenue, its headlights moving across the front windows. Vivette put her hand on Sadie's arm, just for a second. Then she took it away. "Your daddy used to say something," she said. Sade looked at her. "He used to say the hardest thing about teaching was that you never got to see the whole sentence." The kitchen was very quiet. Sade did not ask how she knew that, not yet. Vivette, who had spent 38 years knowing when to let the dough rise without pressing it, did not offer an explanation. They sat together until it was dark outside. Pastor Wendell called at 6:03 in the morning. Sade was already awake. She was at the kitchen table with her coat still on, the spiral notebook open in front of her, working through the appeal documentation that Bernard Ossie had outlined. 231 signatures, 14 letters from neighboring business owners, a property tenure record going back to 1986. She had been at this since 5 o'clock. Her phone was face up on the table. When it lit up and she saw the name, she knew before she answered. Pastor Wendell said, Johns Hopkins. Room 417. Come now. She was there in 22 minutes. The room was a private one, which surprised her. She had not known Vivette had arrangements for a private room, had not known much of anything about what Vivette had arranged for, because Vivette had been arranging things for a long time without telling anyone. Vivette was awake. She was sitting up in the bed with the particular upright posture of a woman who refused to look diminished by a hospital gown, her hands folded on top of the thin blanket, her eyes clear. Pastor Wendell was in the chair by the window. He stood when Sade came in, nodded once, and left without a word. He closed the door behind him. Sade sat in the chair he had left. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The monitor beside the bed made its small, steady sound. Somewhere down the hall, a cart went by. How long? Sade asked. Since March, Vivette said. Pancreatic. Stage 3. She said it the way she said most things, without excess, without asking for anything in return. 8 months. The same month, Sade had started noticing the chair in the corner of the kitchen. The way Vivette's hands moved more slowly in the cold. Sade had thought it was tiredness. She had thought a lot of things. Vivette reached to the metal tray table beside her bed and picked up a brown envelope, the same size and shape as the one on the shelf above the bread table, the same kind of paper, the same sealed flap. She held it out. Sade took it. Open it, Vivette said. Inside were 3 things. The first was a document on cream-colored paper, folded twice, legal language at the top, a notary seal at the bottom. Sade read the first paragraph. She read it again. Then she set it down on her lap and sat very still. The document transferred ownership of 1147 North Avenue. Building, equipment, business license, the name, to Sade M. Calloway. Notarized 7 months ago. Attached a cashier's check for $3,100 with a note clipped to it. 2 years' rent, paid in advance. The second thing was a smaller envelope, plain white, with Sade's name written on the outside in the same handwriting Sade had seen in the recipe book, the same careful, slanted letters. She opened it. A single page, written by hand in blue ink. The letters formed with the deliberateness of someone who had written this more than once before getting it right. She read it. Vivette had written about room 214, Frederick Douglass High School, 1987. A man named Sade Calloway who taught mathematics and who stayed after school every day for 4 months to help a girl named Vivette Marshall Poe pass her junior year. She had been failing. Her mother was sick. She worked nights at a laundromat and came to school without having slept. He had not reported her absences. He had stayed. Every afternoon for 4 months after the other students were gone, he worked through the material with her, slower, without judgment. She graduated in June. He shook her hand and said, "Now go do something with it." She opened the bakehouse 2 years later. Then came the sentence Sade had heard at the kitchen table the night Vivette put her hand on her arm. Not as a question, not as a story, as a truth being handed from one person to another. He used to say the hardest thing about teaching is that you never get to see the whole sentence. Sade Calloway, room 214, 1987. He stayed after class every day for 4 months until I graduated. He never saw what became of me. I need you to know that the whole sentence is this bakehouse. And now the whole sentence is you. Sade sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. She had heard that sentence at her father's kitchen table. He said it the way some people say grace, not performing it, just stating it, because he believed it, and saying it kept him honest about what the work cost. She had heard it so many times it had become part of the furniture of her childhood, unremarkable until now. Now it had weight she had not known it was carrying. The third thing in the envelope was a photograph, small, square, slightly yellowed at the edges. A Polaroid. The same one from the shelf above the bread table. She had picked it up once and put it back without reading it. Now she turned it over. FDHS 1987. The one who stayed. She looked at the photograph. A man in a white dress shirt standing in front of a blackboard, chalk in his hand, looking at something just outside the frame. He looked young. 28 years old, perhaps. 9 years before Sade was born. She knew those eyes the way you know a thing that has always been present without being named. The set of his shoulders. The angle of his head. She had never seen a photograph of her father at this age. She had never needed one before. She did not cry the way people cry in movies. She sat in a hospital chair with a Polaroid in her hands and felt something move through her that did not have a name. Not grief, not gratitude. Something wider than either one. Something that felt like the sentence her father had spent his whole career never getting to see. Completing itself in a room he had never entered. Through a woman he had helped without knowing what he was building, handed to a daughter who had spent 3 years trying to save $23.14. Vivette was watching her. Sade looked up. "He never knew?" she asked. "No," Vivette said. "I tried to find him, after the bakehouse opened. By then he had moved. Nobody had an address." She paused. I found you instead. The monitor continued its small sound. The cart came back down the hall the other way. Somewhere outside, a siren moved through the city and faded. Sade folded the letter carefully. She put it back in the small envelope. She put the envelope inside the larger one with the document and the check. She held it in both hands. Thank you, she said. Vivette looked at her with the expression she had used at the bread table when the dough was exactly right, not praise, recognition. Go file the appeal, she said. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock in the chambers of the Baltimore City Board of Municipal and Zoning Appeals, third floor of the Able Woman Municipal Building on Holiday Street. Sade arrived at 8:41. She was wearing the same dark blazer she had worn to her community college orientation 3 years ago, which still fit, which she had pressed the night before, with an iron she had borrowed from Ms. Eunice, because hers had stopped working in September. She carried the spiral notebook and a manila folder containing the appeal documentation, the signatures, the 14 letters, the property tenures, and a printed copy of the Maryland Code section Bernard Ossie had cited. She had read it 4 times on the bus. The room held 37 seats in the gallery. By 8:55, 41 people were there. She recognized some of them. The man from the dry cleaning shop 2 doors down from the bakehouse, the woman who bought a loaf every Friday morning without the owner of the barber shop at the far end of the block that was also on the acquisition list. Pastor Wendell sat in the second row with his hands on his knees. Vivette was not there. She was still at Johns Hopkins. She had told Say to go. The 5-member board sat at the long table at the front of the room. The city's representative from the Department of Housing and Community Development was a man named Trent Ware, 36, in a navy suit, with a stack of documents in front of him and the practiced composure of someone who had done this many times. Douglas hailed the outcome to be the as it always was. He was not required. The council referred the matter to the appeal board as procedure required when a formal appeal was filed. His role in the hearing was administrative, not present. Sade was called to speak third. She stood at the podium. She did not have notes because the things she needed to say were not in any document she had prepared. She set the manila folder on the podium and looked at the board. She said that Vivette's Bakehouse had operated at 1147 North Avenue for 38 years. She said the owner had purchased the building outright in 1991 with money she had saved working double shifts for 9 years. She said that in that time the bakehouse had served an estimated 250,000 customers, employed 14 people over 3 decades, and had never once been cited for a health violation or a code infraction. She said she knew these things, not because she had looked them up, but because she was one of the 14 people, the most recent of them, and because she had spent 14 months learning this bakehouse from the inside. Then she read from the signatures. Not all 231. The board did not need all 231. She read 12 of them, chosen not because they were the most dramatic, but because they were the most specific. The woman who had brought her newborn to the bakehouse the week she came home from the hospital because it was the first place outside her apartment that had felt safe. The man who had eaten the same roll every morning for 11 years because his mother had brought him there as a boy, and now he brought his own son. The retired teacher who lived alone on Hargrove Road and for whom the Tuesday morning loaf was the only reason she left the apartment on Tuesdays. Before she sat down, she mentioned one more thing. The city's own Baltimore Small Business Stabilization Fund, established in 2019 under Ordinance 19-287, provided grants of up to $25,000 to small businesses disrupted by municipal development projects. The fund had a current unallocated balance of $1.3 million. The bakehouse at 1147 North Avenue had never been informed of its existence. Trenton Ware objected twice on procedural grounds. Both times the board chair overruled him. When Sade sat down, the room was quiet in a way that rooms are sometimes quiet when something has been said that cannot be argued with, only absorbed. The board deliberated for 18 minutes. The vote was 3-2 in favor of granting the appeal and ordering a 180-day suspension of the acquisition, pending a full community impact assessment. It was not a victory. It was time. Bernard Ossie had told her that going in. Time was what the situation required. Sade was on the steps of the Able Woman building at 1114, her phone in her hand, calling Johns Hopkins. Her phone buzzed with a text from a number she did not recognize. 8 words. Meridian is pulling out of the North Avenue project. She did not know who sent it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put the phone back in her bag and continued dialing. Inside City Hall, 4 blocks away, Douglas Hale's phone showed an incoming call from Garrett Foss at 11:16. He let it go to voicemail. A minute later, another call. Then a text, "You just cost us 40 M. You're done in this city. We will remember this." Douglas read the text. He set the phone face down on the desk. He stood up and walked to the window and looked out at Baltimore. He had been standing at this window for 6 years making decisions that moved in one direction. He had done that because direction was something, and he had believed for a long time that something was better than nothing. He was no longer certain that was true. He picked up his phone and opened his email. He drafted a message to the Baltimore Small Business Coalition, which he had been meaning to contact for 3 years without ever finding the right moment. He wrote that he was available to advise on community impact policy and that he was not seeking compensation. He sent it before he had time to reconsider. Then he sat down at his desk, picked up a pen, and looked at the 3 unsigned documents that were still sitting in the same place he had left them 10 days ago. He did not sign them. He opened his desk drawer and put them inside. The Meridian campaign contribution, $400,000, committed but not yet transferred, was formally withdrawn at 3:17 that afternoon. Douglas received the notification by email. The subject line read, "Campaign contribution, withdrawal of commitment." He read it once. He filed it in a folder on his desktop labeled 2024. He went back to work. He did not go home the long way that evening. He went home the direct way for the first time in 3 months, because something had shifted in the weight of what he was carrying, and the long way was no longer necessary. Vivette Marshall Poe died on a Thursday morning in late February, 11 weeks after the hearing at the Abel Woolman Building. She died at Johns Hopkins in the same private room with Pastor Wendell in the chair by the window, and Sade in the chair she had pulled up beside the bed. It was early before 5 o'clock, still dark outside. The monitors made it sound for the last time, and then it made a different sound, and then a nurse came in quietly. Pastor Wendell put his hand on Sade's shoulder for a moment. Then he went to the window and looked out at Baltimore. The service was held 9 days later at Greater Hope Baptist Church on Druid Hill Avenue. The pews were full, not because Vivette had been famous or powerful, or because her death had been announced anywhere beyond the bakehouse window, where Sadie had taped a handwritten card. They were full because 38 years of bread, and 38 years of showing up, and 38 years of knowing which cubbies were empty at lunchtime had left a particular kind of residue in a neighborhood, the kind that fills a church on a cold Thursday morning when the city has not told anyone to come. Pastor Wendell spoke for 22 minutes. He said Vivette had never sought recognition. He said she had sought precision in her dough, in her accounts, in the people she chose to trust with the things she had built. He said she had found one such person and she had planned accordingly. Sade sat in the front row. She did not cry during the service. She cried in the car afterward alone, with the engine running and the heater on, for 6 minutes. Then she drove back to North Avenue. The following month, she filed the final semester of her coursework at Community College of Baltimore County. She attended the spring commencement in May. 4 people came: Ms. Eunice, Pastor Wendell, an elderly woman named Mrs. Garrison, who had been buying bread at Vivette since 1994 and who had brought a card, and Bernard Ossie, who had not been invited but showed up anyway with a small bouquet of flowers from the giant on Reisterstown Road. Sade thanked him at the parking lot. He said he had seen a lot of appeals. He said hers was the only one where the petitioner had memorized the code section by the second meeting. The business license was transferred to her name in April. The sign above the door remained the same: Vivette's Bakehouse. She had considered changing it for approximately 1 afternoon. Then she had looked at the shelf above the bread table, at the empty space where the brown envelope had been, and where the Polaroid photograph still stood. Her father, chalk in hand, 1987, and she had decided that the name belonged to the thing that had built it, and the thing that had built it deserved to keep its name. She added one element to the interior: a small table near the front window, 2 chairs, a wire rack of books on loan from the Enoch Pratt Free Library branch on Reisterstown Road. On the wall beside it, she hung a single photograph in a plain wooden frame: the man in the white dress shirt standing in front of a blackboard, chalk in hand. No caption. Customers asked about him sometimes. She always said the same thing: the one who stayed. She graduated from the Small Business Development Program and did not use the certificate to change anything about the way she ran the bakehouse. She used it to understand what she was already doing and why it worked. 16 months after the hearing, Douglas Hale announced he would not seek re-election. He did not give a reason in the press release. He gave one in a later interview with a small Baltimore publication that covered neighborhood policy. He said he had spent 6 years making decisions at a scale that made the people behind the addresses invisible, and that he wanted to work at a scale where he could see them. He joined the Baltimore Small Business Coalition as a volunteer policy advisor and attended his first meeting on a Tuesday morning, arriving 7 minutes early, sitting in a folding chair listening. He never went to the bakehouse. He did not know that the woman who had stood at the podium in the Abel Woolman building was the same woman whose light he had seen at 5 in the morning on North Avenue, or the same woman who had inherited something from a woman who had once fed a boy with 35 cents in an empty apartment. He did not need to know. Some chains of consequence are not visible from any single link. You can only see them from a distance, and by then the people who made them are usually somewhere else doing the next thing. Sade was at the bread table at 4:15 in the morning on the day this story ends. The soles of her New Balance 608s had finally separated past the point of glue at the end of October. She had replaced them with a pair from the Foot Locker on Liberty Road, $47, exact size, and the new ones did not creak on the two spots on the floor that complained if you stepped too far left. She had not memorized the new shoes yet. She was learning them. The shelf above the bread table held what it now held: the recipe book with the dark green spine, worn at the corners, the space where the brown envelope had been, the Polaroid photograph leaning against the spine, the same way it had leaned since before she arrived, the same way she expected it would lean for the duration of whatever came next. She reached past it for the bread flour and began to measure. The light was on, yellow, slightly dim, the only light on North Avenue burning at this hour. It was the right temperature for this kind of work, and for the particular kind of person who showed up to do it before the rest of the city was awake, not because anyone had asked them to, but because some things needed doing, and they were the ones who knew how. Calvin Calloway never got to see the whole sentence. He stayed after class every afternoon for 4 months and shook a girl's hand at graduation and said, "Now go do something with it," and went home not knowing what she would do with it, or what his daughter would do with what she left behind. That is the hardest thing about teaching. That is the hardest thing about any kind of work that plants something in another person and then steps back and trusts the growing to happen without you. He never knew. But the sentence kept going. It is still going now. This story is fiction. Sade Calloway, Vivette Poe, Douglas Hale, and Calvin Calloway are invented. The bakehouse at 1147 North Avenue does not exist, but what surrounds them does. From 1949 to 1973, federally funded urban renewal programs across the United States displaced an estimated 300,000 to 400,000 Black families and destroyed thousands of Black-owned businesses in the name of civic improvement. Historians have called it by different names. Residents of the neighborhoods it moved through often used one word: removal. In Baltimore specifically, urban renewal projects eliminated entire commercial corridors in Black neighborhoods during this period, the effects of which are still measurable in property ownership rates and small business density today. The Maryland Workforce Development Grant referenced in this story is based on real programs that exist in modified forms across several states. Nationally, more than 30% of single mothers live below the poverty line. The administrative appeal process described in this story reflects actual rights that exist under Maryland law, rights that most people in Sadie's position do not know about because no one has told them. I write these stories because I believe the people who show up before sunrise and do the work that doesn't get named deserve to be seen. Not saved, not rescued, seen. Calvin Calloway stayed after class. He never found out what it became. Most people who do the quiet, necessary work never do. This story is for them. Now here is the question I want to leave with you, and I already know it is going to split the room. Sade kept the name Vivette's Bakehouse. She did not rename it after herself. She did not rename it after her father. She kept the name of the woman who built it. 38 years of flour and bread and deliberate kindness pressed into 4 words above a door on North Avenue. Some people will say that is humility. Some will say it's his loyalty. Some will say she should have changed it, that what she built from that point forward was hers, and hers deserved a name. What do you think? Leave your answer in the comments. Tell me what you would have done and why. I read every single one, and this is the kind of question where the answers matter more than the story. And here is the second question, the quieter one. Is there a Calvin Calloway in your life? A teacher who stayed? A neighbor who handed you something without making it a transaction? A person who put your name on something before you knew you were ready to carry it? Someone who started a sentence that you are still finishing without knowing they began it? If there is, and I think for most of you there is, call them. Not a text. Not a like on a post from 3 years ago. A call. Let them hear your voice. Let them know the sentence kept going. If they are gone, tell someone else what they did. That is how it keeps going. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And leave a comment. I want to know whose sentence you are still finishing. Stay kind, stay present, and never underestimate the sentence someone else started for you. See you in the next one.